I think we have a serious problem now. We had around 30 speakers, and how much time? 40 minutes. And we have also here forget it. You're the 32nd.
No, he's on the list.
And my proposal is that because we are in association with SEDE, that we take first the coordinators of AFET and SEDE. I think the only fair situation is it and that would mean everyone 1 minute, then we can get so many as possible. If you agree with that procedure, I think it's the only one how we can do that. And therefore, I would like to ask now Mrs. Fortiga, as the chairperson of the Subcommittee on Security and Defense, to take first the floor. But, Mr. Secretary General, and burden sharing, we have to remind the Americans, no, you're the 33rd.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary
No, I am not finished.
Oh, sorry.
I am not finished. We should remind the Americans that the costs includes also the costs of soft power as preparation. And if the European Union and its member states pay 60% of developing aid of this world, and the European Union from its budget gives 3 times so much money for non-military foreign aid, then it should be taken into account if you come to a fair definition of burden sharing. And I do not think that we have possibility to have much more money out of national budget. Even the United Kingdom, which is always close to NATO, has now decided not to meet the 2% criteria. It's just the lightest budget decisions, and therefore this question of closer cooperation in order to getting synergy effects, getting out of more of the money which is available, I think is, in my opinion, the more future-orientated possibility. But now the floor has Mrs. Fortiga.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary General, a warm welcome to the European Parliament. Thank you for your contribution, your remarks. I would like to say that you are one of a few European politicians who have certain sentiment, to whom we in Poland have certain sentiment, because you contributed some time ago as Prime Minister to our energy security. Unfortunately, it was undermined later, yet we remember this. I mean the pipeline from Norway to Nehoge, the project of this. Secretary, your predecessor, Fogh Rasmussen, during NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Dubrovnik, reiterated the NATO promise to Ukraine and Georgia to become one day NATO members. How would you describe their situation now? And secondly, you were talking during also NATO Parliamentary Assembly in The Hague about trust funds for Ukraine. How would you attract trustees to contribute to these trust funds? Thanks.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
Secretary General, on behalf of the European People's Party group in the Foreign Committee, I would like to welcome you here. Now, a personal point regarding what you've called the complementary relationship and coordination with the European Union, particularly in the context of crisis management. I certainly agree that there is a great complementarity we can develop and enhance. Nonetheless, I'm not so sure that that complementarity should go so far as actually sharing out tasks. We sometimes hear that those talk about everything military being left to NATO and all the civil operations being handed over to the European Union. It seems to me that, given the wide range of threats surrounding us, which you quite rightly recalled, the European Union is not in a position to be able to have to do without a military strategy. Particularly if you look to the south and the threats there, you know very well the limits to NATO's ability to take crisis management steps there, particularly given the cultures involved. Now, this is also linked to another issue that's being more and more discussed, namely Turkey's position, which has been somewhat odd, shall we say, in relation to a number of the regional crises. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Many thanks from our side as well for your clear and nevertheless well thought out statement. I often get the impression when a NATO Secretary General has spoken, well, that hasn't always been the case when I've been listening to people from NATO. But looking now at the different tasks that we have ahead of us, you talked about some of the examples that could make cooperation not only possible but indeed necessary. You talked about support for Southern Europe, you talked about Jordan, and that's the kind of issue where we have our full support. I have two questions connected to my fields of interest. What about the situation in the Western Balkans, first of all? I'm rapporteur for Albania, that's of interest to me. And secondly, I'd like to know, in the current conflict with Russia, are there any possibilities where you would consider, where Russia would consider attacking a NATO member state in order to fulfill its goals in Ukraine?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General over here. Well, my group, the third group, the ECR, we are a strongly Atlanticist, pro-NATO group. We reiterate your calls for maintaining the 2% or increasing to the 2% defence spending in all our member states. And we oppose duplication of CSDP and NATO military operations and don't wish to see any unnecessary decoupling either of the USA's mutual interests in the defence sector with the European Union. And I am reassured by your comments that there is a large degree of NATO coordination with the EU. You mentioned both the fighting of piracy in the Indian Ocean to enhancing cyber security. But just out of interest, how often do you or your Deputy Secretary Generals actually meet Mrs. Mogherini or her senior staff here in Brussels? On the issue of Libya, NATO very successful in ending the Gaddafi regime, but what next if the UN Leon talks fail? You mentioned the fact we need to wait till security re-establishes itself, but surely we can't just wait, given the fact that it's so close to our borders, and Libya, of course, now has the presence of ISIS, which makes it even a more dangerous failed state scenario. And lastly, NATO enlargement, like EU enlargement, has been a great success story. As rapporteur from Montenegro, could you give me an indication when that country is likely to be invited to join, given the fact that Albania is already a full member of NATO?
Thank you,
Chairman. Thank you, Secretary General, for your introductory statement. I'll keep this very brief.
Maybe I wait for the translation. U heeft gesproken in Wales over de 2% van het budget.
In Wales, you mentioned the 2% of GDP that the member states should be contributing to the NATO budget, but we're hearing more and more reports from member states saying that they're not going to be able to meet that target. Do you carry out an annual assessment? I wonder whether you have some pointers as to which direction we're heading in on that front. Then, I'd like to hear from you how great a threat you see from Russia towards Europe Russia remains one of Europe's neighbours. So how seriously do you take the threat? What risk do you think there really is of Putin using nuclear weapons, as he claimed he was prepared to do on TV? And how can we get out of the current crisis situation? This is something that is occupying us every day in the European Parliament. Then, building up European defence. You mentioned the figures again. How can we ensure that we have joint investment in procurement? Can the NATO member states at least act together to create the call for a European defence force?
Tack så mycket. Ja, du talar mycket om försvarsinvesteringar medan jag väljer att tala om försvarskostnader.
You've talked a lot about investment in defence. I would actually talk more in terms of defence costs. We need to address the 2% of GDP figure. Surely quality is more important than quantity, isn't it? If you set that sort of goal, you don't necessarily see the details. If you're just investing in warfare, what about money for training, for staff? You've got all this military equipment, all well and good, but if people aren't trained to use it properly, what's the point? We need to take a fresh look at the 2% figure, and perhaps envisaging increasing the defence budget in general. And then you mentioned Libya. We'll need to revisit that. Well, I'd like to ask this. What lessons did we learn from what happened in Libya? We withdrew from Libya fairly recently, but we didn't have a good exit strategy. And we see that this was followed by chaos. How can we do things better in future?
Very well. Okay. Mr. Stoltenberg, you're of course a keen supporter of Norwegian membership of the European Union, so I'm not surprised to hear your own support for closer political and military ties between the European Union and NATO. What concerns me, of course, is a casus fideris. You know, under Article 5, NATO members are asked to consider support for a colleague country which is in trouble. Of course, under Article 42, subsection 7 of Lisbon, an obligation of aid and assistance by all means must be given by member states within the power. We've heard only 2 weeks ago President Juncker call for a European Union army. How would that affect an oath of allegiance? When I served in Her Majesty's forces, my oath of allegiance was to the Crown. Does that create some sort of conflict, perhaps, with NATO with regards to an emerging, increasingly military outlook from the European, and how does that affect NATO? And I have to agree with you on one thing, though. 2% is, I think, something that should be put forward by all NATO states. I do support, my party supports a 2% contribution. But of course, as GDP continues to fall, we're in an economic decline in the European Union. Just finishing, Mr. Brock. As we're in economic decline, of course, that figure becomes even less. So an independent Britain would be in a far stronger position because our GDP, of course, would be much higher to have a higher stake of 2%. Thank you.
Thank you. I will try to be brief, and some of you asked the same, at least not the same questions, but related to some of the same issues. So I should try to be as brief as possible. First, to Ms. Fatiga on the open door in Ukraine. So first of all, the very important thing is that it is the right of every sovereign nation to decide its own path, including what kind of security arrangements it wants to be part of. And this is not something just I state, but this is something which is enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act and in many other documents and treaties and agreements. And it's quite obvious that part of being independent, part of being sovereign, is also that you have the right to decide whether you would like to be part of an alliance or not. And we have to respect both decisions. We should never try to force anyone into any kind of alliance or organizations, but if they want, then this is a question between that applicant nation and the organization. So if anyone wants to become a member of NATO, that's a question which has to be decided by the 28 NATO allies and the country that applies for membership, no one else have any right to intervene or to try to veto. And that also, of course, goes for Russia, because then they try to re-establish some kind of spheres of influence where they are trying to control their neighbors. Georgia, they have applied for membership. We have a comprehensive package helping Georgia with training, with reform, with institution building. We are establishing a big training center there, and all of this we do to try to help them on their way towards NATO membership and to qualify meeting the standards of a NATO member. Ukraine announced recently that they will start a reform process aiming at applying for membership later on. They have said that this will take some time, but so the point is that we will assess a possible application of Ukraine in exactly the same way as we assess any other application for membership. But that we have to come back to when and if they apply. Then I was also asked about Montenegro. I can take that in the same round, and that is that it was Charles Tannock who asked me about Montenegro, and Montenegro is a country where we have promised to make an assessment to take decisions by the end of this year. So this is something we have to address within NATO in the quite near future. Then Danjean, I would like to underline that NATO is both a political alliance and a military alliance. So it's not that NATO always do only military work. We have also a lot of political cooperation with many partners, with many countries all around the world. But of course we have some unique tools when it comes to military capabilities, our command structure, the interoperability of our forces, and the long experience we have in conducting military operations. Then Fleckenstein. Also, you asked me whether I believe there will be a conflict with Russia. Also, we don't see any imminent threat against any NATO ally. Therefore, our focus is on how can we continue to provide deterrence. Because one reason why we don't see any imminent threat against any NATO ally is, of course, that NATO is able to provide credible deterrence. And that's the reason why we are increasing the readiness, the preparedness of our forces, and developing new capabilities. So that's the success of NATO, is that we have been together for more than 60 years. We have been able to provide the necessary deterrence and defense for all NATO allies. Then I was asked about Libya. Western Balkans. I'll try to be brief. The problem with the Western Balkans, well, I think Western Balkans is an area, or is a region, where we have seen the European Union and NATO working together in a very good way. We just visited Kosovo. We have the NATO KFOR force there, essential for stability, security. It's welcomed both by Pristina and Belgrade. And then we have the European Union, the ULEX, doing law enforcement, and of course we work together. And what NATO does and what the European Union does is complementary, and together we provide stability, security for Kosovo. So that's an excellent example of how the European Union and NATO can work together. We have also cooperation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the Western Balkans faces many challenges, but at the same time I think the Western Balkans, ever since we had the NATO operations there at the end of the 1990s, Kosovo, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and up till now is an example of how Europe, NATO, is taking responsibility to stabilize its neighborhood, both because we have a moral duty to do so, but also because by stabilizing Western Balkans, we also create more security for ourselves. Then how often do I meet Mogherini? I meet her quite often, actually. So we have met several times. I met her just, I think, 1 or 2 days after she took office. She's an old friend, and we have excellent relationship. I met also with Donald Tusk. I met with Martin Schulz, and I meet many of the political leaders in the European Union. We have staff-to-staff cooperation, and we work on, as I said, different areas together, like, for instance, the Western Balkans, but also in Afghanistan. NATO forces have provided for years security, which has been essential for the European Union and others to provide development aid, development assistance. We are working together off the Horn of Africa to fight piracy. So we have a lot of cooperation already, but we want more. And that's a responsibility, that's a task for many different levels, from the top and throughout our organizations, to develop more cooperation between the NATO and the European Union. Then Ms. Woutmans, you mentioned the 2%, and several of you mentioned that, and let me just underline. So I have to be honest with you and tell you that when I was Minister of Finance, I was responsible for cutting defense spending. And I did it with, what I say, a great enthusiasm. As Minister of Finance and governments have done all over Europe since 1990. And in the beginning, I think actually it was possible to say or to defend it, because we had the end of the Cold War, we had a completely changed security situation. So I remember that I said in my government that since the security environment has changed, the Cold War was over, it was possible to reduce defense spending. But then when the security environments change again, and we are moving into a situation where we see new threats, new challenges, both from the east and from the south, then we must be able to adapt once again. So that was one of the reasons why, when I was Prime Minister, I started to increase defense spending in my country. So the challenge is to be able to reduce defense spending when tensions are going down, but to be able to increase them when there is a need for increased defense spending. And now the world is more challenging, and we have to increase defense spending. No one is expecting that we're going to reach 2% tomorrow. What we said in Wales at the NATO summit was to stop the cuts and then gradually increase. I understand that reaching 2% might be difficult, and I also agree with my Ceballos, or my Suya, that it's important to spend the money efficiently, and therefore I support all efforts, the pooling and the sharing by the European Union, the smart defense by NATO, all efforts to try to make sure that we are spending more and more efficiently. But as I said, we cannot get more out of less indefinitely. So at some stage after 25 years of defense decline, we have to at least stop the cuts and gradually start to increase again. And the last thing I will say about defense spending is that all politicians, at least almost all politicians, would like to spend money on something else than defense. On health, on education, on infrastructure. But sometimes you also have to invest in your security, because security is so basic for so much more. Our open, free societies, our prosperity, and the stability around us. So therefore we have to invest in defense. Then it was James Carver. You said it was not strange that I was in favour of closer cooperation with the European Union, and that's since I was not able to get Norway into the European Union. That's true. I was strongly fighting in favour of Norway joining the European Union, but you know, Norway is the only country in the world which has negotiated an accession treaty into the European Union and then voted it down, not only once but twice. And I lost both referendums, so then I left Norwegian politics. But anyway, it is important. I believe in the cooperation, and you are right. Then on European defence, also, it's up to the European Union to decide. And I welcome all efforts by any European nation to develop defence capabilities, to strengthen its defences, to invest more in defence. That will increase the security of both NATO allies and European nations. But, and this is important, we have to avoid duplications, and we have to make sure that what the European Union is doing is complementary to what NATO is doing. Because NATO has been able to provide security and collective defence for European allies for 65 years. We should continue to do so, but then we have to make sure that we are using our resources in the best possible way, and then we have to avoid duplication and make sure that what we do is complementary, or when the European Union is doing is complementary to what NATO is doing. Well, I think that was all the questions. I tried to be brief, but it's not so easy. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, 1 minute each. Tune Keller.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Stoltenberg, for your rapid response to the Ukrainian crisis and other crises also. And you just said that you don't see imminent threat to any NATO members. However, representing Estonia and also my Latvian colleagues, I would say that there are widespread assumptions that the next target, in case Mr. Putin would decide to continue aggression, would be the Baltic states. And here, Mr. Putin wants to test just NATO's credibility, because here's the best chance to compromise it. We know about the NATO's Article number 5, but the problem is that aggression has become, forms of aggression have become much more fluid, vague, using proxies. And also my question is about continuing Russian military maneuvers in our neighborhood. I expect that by conducting these maneuvers, a grey zone would be created where regular provocations could transform into aggression. Are you prepared for such an eventuality? And you mentioned, I think the crucial credibility gap is now the financing of our defense expenditure. You mentioned that we are trying to decrease, to stop decreasing budgets, but how to overcome this situation? Yes.
Mr. Secretary General, do you think indeed EU and NATO are building this resilience together when, for instance, challenged with Ukraine, they are not able to counter the propaganda campaign, the lying campaign engineered by Russia, and with a media campaign with a truth geared into the public opinion of Russia? And when actually there are contradictory statements by EU and NATO spokespersons on the assessment of the threats on the ground. And then also when our members in the framework of NATO or EU are not even coordinating, for instance, supplying the equipment that the Peshmergas need to actually eradicate ISIS from their ground. And talking about the investment in defense sector and defense investment, do we actually need to spend more or to spend better and deliver indeed in what we spend? For instance, when we see our member states shedding capacities and selling technology, European defense technology companies to, or critical infrastructure for instance, Chinese state companies?
1 minute, please.
First come the coordinators of the existing groups. The floor has now Geoffrey van Orden.
Thank you very much, and you're very welcome, Secretary General. Can I just say to start with, let's not confuse the European Union and the European nations, and thank goodness the European defence is not a matter for the European Union. And unfortunately, the EU, as an institution, is too concerned with just placing its institutional footprint on things rather than doing what's useful. And unlike my good friend and colleague, Mr. Danjean, I think there should be a division of labour with NATO and that the EU should focus on the civil task. My quick question is on the subject of public information. Too often the battle is lost not on the battlefield but in the living rooms of our citizens. We've now got an increasingly sceptical and perhaps war-weary public. Do you think more needs to be done by organisations like NATO to communicate the need for NATO, the need for our armed forces, so that our public have a better understanding? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary General. When I see you, I can't help but recall the words you said after the horrible Breivik attacks, when you said what we need in the face of these atrocities is more humanity, more freedom, and more democracy. And I wish you a lot of wisdom in these very challenging times to indeed build resilience of open societies. And in that context, I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on what resilience, in your opinion, looks like when it comes to the digital domain. We've seen some thought exercises in the Tallinn manual, but it's really important, in my opinion, that we also underpin any actions by the appropriate legal framework and judiciary and democratic oversight when it comes to any kind of capacity, whether it be offensive or defensive. So perhaps you can shed some light on what you believe that resilience of our systems, rather, in the context of open societies online looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary General. In following on what's just been said by my colleague, obviously European security cannot be defined just in military terms. Resilience and European security has to be defined with a wider spectrum. Now, I would be interested in how you want to promote those dimensions when you always insist so heavily on this one figure of 2% GDP. I strongly believe that this is creating a situation in which we're not able to mine the efficiencies that we could still have. We're spending too much money on too little bang for the buck. And I think if we now say, let's spend more, we will not be more efficient, and we will be directing our attention just to the military and not to resilience.
Secretary General, currently an American convoy is passing the Czech Republic. The troops of this convoy have participated in the common military exercise in Baltic countries. In the Czech Republic, the troops are welcomed by thousands of Czech people. The convoy shows that we are all committed to protect our common values. Secretary General, I would like to ask you whether you think that there is time to show that we are really committed also to show our values in.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. You mentioned with good reasons threats from the east, threats from the south, but agree that we must not keep a blind eye to challenges coming from the southeast. Having said that, how do you perceive Russian activities in the Western Balkans? For example, recent joint military exercise between Serbia in vicinity of the Croatian border. Do you believe that is an isolated event organized deliberately around Mr. President Putin's visit to Belgrade, or is it a part of the certain Russian strategic approach to this still sensitive European area? And my second question is, how do you see, from security point of view, recruitment and flow of number of the people from the Western Balkans countries to fight on Islamic State side? Thank you.
Signor Borghesio.
Thank
you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, I must say,
giunge notizia.
I heard some news that President Erdogan expressed his great satisfaction with the fall of the Syrian city of Idlib, with respect to the Hajj al-Aswad. Now, this is an excellent opportunity to hear what the Secretary General of NATO, how they would qualify the role of Turkey and their regime with respect to the situation in the combats and those fighting for the defense of our values are called upon, and how, that they are committed to into the fight of terrorists, fighting terrorists in the Islamic State, because the Turks have not always been totally in line. There's a conflict between our values and the Islamic one.
Mr. Secretary General, you just spoke about the situation in the Western Balkans, and I would also like to ask you how you see the current political situation in Serbia with regard to what my Croatian colleague Picula already said. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary General, thank you for coming here and sharing your thoughts with us, and also your expression that you want to see further closer cooperation between the EU and the NATO. As a shadow rapporteur for Bosnia, I want to ask you a question that NATO has expressed the desire for Bosnia to join the club. This is welcomed by the organs of the EU, as we see Bosnia as a future member of the Euro-Atlantic family. Secretary General, currently the conditionality for Bosnia's membership includes provisions which requires the registration of immovable defence properties as state property. This condition has given certain politicians in the country a veto over Bosnia's future NATO membership. At the same time, NATO is having intensified and focused talks with the neighbouring Montenegro, as you expressed before, and we hope that they'll be joining. In light of the EU's renewed focus on Bosnia, will NATO now reconsider this conditionality and therefore fast-track Bosnia's membership into our alliance? And the last 2 seconds, I'll be very quick. The issue of Iran and the nuclear talk, of course, we wish that to be successful. Now, I've visited together with the chair with many countries in the Arab world where they see a huge concern about Iran. How do you see Iran's role in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary General, first, how do you assess the probability of further Russian invasion in Ukraine? Second, is NATO prepared to respond to the hybrid war against NATO frontline states? Third, would you support the idea of deducting up to 2% of the GDP from the fiscal discipline target in EU? Thank you.
First to Mr. Kalman on whether there are threats against the Baltic states and whether NATO is prepared to defend them. And as I said, we don't see any imminent threat against any NATO ally, and that includes the Baltic states. But what we see is a new security environment. We see a more assertive Russia. We see a Russia responsible for aggressive actions. And we have to remember that this is not only in Ukraine, but Russia has deployed forces in Moldova. They have used forces in Georgia. And they annexed Crimea, and they are supporting the separatists, destabilizing eastern Ukraine. So what we see in Ukraine is part of a pattern, and that, of course, increases the reasons for concern. And this is the reason why we are adapting our forces to this new security environment. And as I've already outlined, we have doubled the size of our NATO response force, and we are making them more ready, more prepared, and we are doing more exercises. We have more forces in the eastern part of the alliance, and we are making reinforcement easier, also by establishing these command and control units in all the Baltic countries. So all of this we do to make sure that we also, in this new security environment, is able to continue to do what NATO has done for decades, and that is to protect and defend all allies against any threat. And that's the reason why we are adapting, so we can continue to provide the security guarantees for also, of course, the Baltic countries. So we are prepared, but we are prepared because we are adapting, because we are investing, and because we are implementing the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. Then Ms. Gomes and some others asked me about information and the Russian propaganda campaign. So Russia is conducting a propaganda campaign, and they are spreading a lot of information which is obviously or propaganda which is painting a picture of what's going on, which is completely wrong. But I believe very strongly that we should not meet propaganda with propaganda. We should tell the truth, and in the long run, the truth will prevail over propaganda. And that's, of course, the responsibility of NATO. I think I do that almost daily. I try to comment, I try to convey our message in different speeches, interviews, and so on. The European Union has to do it. We can try to work even closer together to develop the message. We share the same values. We have the same approach. But I would also like to underline that in addition to what the European Union and NATO can do, this is also very much a responsibility of each and every allied country to answer, to respond to the propaganda of Russia, which often aims at specific nations or specific groups. In addition, I really believe this is an individual responsibility we all have to take part in the debate and to answer when we see statements from Russia which we disagree with or which we know are propaganda. Then, you asked, just to underline it, we have to spend both more and better. It's not either more or better. But what I'm trying to convey to you is that we have decreased defense spending for 25 years. And we are below 1.5%. And last year, we all agreed that threats went up. But we still continued to decrease our defense spending in real terms by 3%. So there is we cannot choose between either increased spending or spending better. We have to do both, because we cannot get more out of less indefinitely. Then, Mr. van den Orden, you also asked me about public information, and I would like to underline the following: that our most important strength is that we have our values, that we believe in open democratic societies. That's common for the European Union and NATO. And because we believe in open democratic societies, we will not always have exactly the same message on all issues. There will be different opinions, different views, and open debate. But that's not a weakness, that's a strength. Because you only have in totalitarian societies one opinion about every issue. The important thing is that we agree on the main message, that we will defend open democratic societies. Because we are certain that open democratic societies are stronger than the totalitarian societies. And I think history has proven that again and again. But then we have to defend them, we have to protect them, and we have to stay united in the defense of open democratic societies, accepting that within those societies there will be an open democratic debate. Then Ms. Schake asked me about cyber. And I would like to start by telling you that NATO has made it clear, we did that last fall, that a cyber attack can trigger Article 5 or our collective defense. Because a cyber attack can be as serious as a conventional attack. It can destroy infrastructure, and it can cause a lot of harm. And therefore we are both doing a lot to increase our capabilities when it comes to defense of NATO networks, but we're also doing more to help allies defend their own networks. And we have established a team which we can send out to nations, if needed, to help them to defend and to re-establish their networks if they are attacked. Of course, it's always a balance between protecting privacy, accepting the rights of individuals, and at the same time being able to protect the collective security of a nation. But I think that when it comes to cyber, I think it's extremely important that we are aware of that this is a threat which we have to take very seriously, and we are doing a lot of exercises. I visited Estonia before Christmas, and I saw the biggest exercise which NATO has ever conducted when it comes to cyber and cyber defense. Then, Mr. Butikofer. You asked me also about Russia, and I don't think that. I think that the aim of Russia is to re-establish a system of spheres of influence, and we don't accept that, because every nation is sovereign. We should respect the borders and the territorial integrity of every nation, and that's the reason why we are doing what we are doing. Then, Mr. Stetina, you asked me about whether we should show our values, as far as I understood, and I will say yes. That's our strength. That's what really makes us different than compared to totalitarian regimes, but also in the fight against ISIL, in the fight against extremism. I think that the best way of protecting our open and free societies is to continue to be open and free societies, and to stay very strong. And it was a very moving experience to be in Paris after the terrorist attack and see hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets to defend the right of all of us against this terrorist attack, which was not only at innocent people, but which was also aimed at the core values of our societies, the freedom of speech, the freedom of opinion. And as you know, you have also now US troops exercising in your country, part of a broad European exercise, and they are there to make sure that everyone understands that an attack on one ally will be an attack on all allies, which is the core idea of NATO. Then Mr. Pisula, Serbia. So Serbia is a sovereign and independent country, and therefore they make their own decisions. And they have decided to make to exercise with Russia. That's their right to decide. But Serbia also do a lot of exercises together with NATO. And I met with the Serbian Prime Minister recently, and he underlined that they will continue to do exercises with NATO and actually want more cooperation with NATO. And we have signed a partnership agreement with Serbia. So I think we just have to accept that not all countries want to be a member of NATO, at least not immediately. but we should welcome cooperation with them, and we are developing our cooperation with Serbia. Then Mr. Vogesio, you asked me about Turkey. And Turkey, I will only say that Turkey is the ally most Turkey is the ally most affected by the crisis in Syria and Iraq. They have received hundreds of thousands of refugees. They are part of the alliance or the coalition fighting ISIL, and they are also contributing to the training of soldiers to fight ISIL. So Turkey is playing an important role in the fight against ISIL and extremism in Iraq and Syria. Mr. McAllister, Western Balkan. Western Balkan is, of course, a region with great challenges, and there are some problems we should not underestimate. For instance, the ability for Bosnia-Herzegovina to move forward on the path towards NATO membership. We have seen very little reform, and we have seen, especially when it comes to the question of defense property, which is a key issue related to whether Bosnia-Herzegovina can qualify to become a NATO member. We have seen not progress in the way we want it to be. We have the challenges in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, the name issues related to potential membership of the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia to NATO or into NATO. And of course there are still a lot of challenges in the region. But I think also the experience, as I've underlined already, from Western Balkans is that when NATO and Europe the European Union, when we work together, we can achieve a lot. So we have to continue to work together, especially in the Western Balkans. These are countries which are on the path on the Euro-Atlantic cooperation, and I welcome that. And then we have to continue to work with them, to support them and help them. Yeah, actually, Mr. Khan, you asked me about Bosnia, and I think I already actually answered the question on Bosnia. You asked me about Iran. I support very much the efforts to try to reach an agreement related to Iran's nuclear program. And, of course, Iran should also accept and adhere to the non-proliferation treaty, which is a key treaty aiming at avoiding the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Yeah, that was so far.
Thank you very much for this discussion. Sorry, I see our Swedish non-member friend was always interested in NATO questions. A few of us didn't get the floor, but next time they have more rights to do so. And but because it was a joint session with SEDE, we had to do it in that way. Thank you very much, Secretary General, for answering these questions, and I hope we can continue the debate. I think there will be need for that, and perhaps we could do that after the June EU summit. And that outcome, what that could mean for our practical cooperation. So let's think about this after the summer break to come to a further meeting in order to discuss these things, and hopefully the situation is not even worse than today. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.